The lobby of the Aurora Towers was pristine marble and cold silence, broken only by the sharp click of designer heels and the hum of elevators. At 8:37 a.m., just as the building's wealthy tenants were rushing out with coffee cups and phones glued to their ears, a sudden piercing cry echoed through the space. A small girl, no older than 7, dropped to the floor beside the concierge desk. Her hands clutched the sides of her head, and her little body trembled in frantic pulses. One shoe was gone. Her hair, a neat braid just minutes earlier, now looked storm-tossed. People stopped. Some stared. Others kept walking, awkwardly averting their eyes. The concierge stiffened but didn't move. A man in a navy suit mumbled, "Where's her nanny?" A woman whispered, "Who lets their child behave like that?" The girl's cries didn't stop. They rose and broke like waves crashing in panic. Her arms flailed when someone tried to offer her a water bottle. She knocked it away and curled into herself. At that moment, a cart rolled in from the service hallway. Isabel, the janitor, pushed it quietly. Dressed in navy coveralls and faded sneakers, she kept her eyes low, as she always did. She was known to most residents only as the cleaning lady, someone whose presence was invisible until something smelled like bleach. But today, her eyes lifted. She saw the girl, trembling, sweating, breathing too fast. Without a word, Isabel parked her cart by the wall. She unzipped one of the side pockets. From it, she pulled a tiny bottle of soap bubbles. Residents barely noticed. A few scoffed. Others watched, confused. One man asked if this was appropriate, but Isabel knelt beside the girl, not touching, not speaking. Just close enough. She opened the bottle slowly, dipped the wand, and gently blew. A single bubble floated out, catching the morning light. Then another, then 3. The girl didn't look at Isabel, but her crying faltered. Her head turned, a bubble landed on her arm and popped softly. Isabel kept blowing, rhythmic, slow, as if each breath held a story. The girl's body loosened and her hands lowered from her ears. The space around them felt quieter, almost sacred. The concierge stepped forward, but Isabel lifted a hand, not to defy, but to ask for stillness. Another bubble floated. This one the girl followed with her eyes. Someone in the back whispered, "She's calming down." Someone else took a photo. Above, on the mezzanine level where glass railings offered a view of the lobby below, a tall man in a charcoal suit had been watching. His name was Callum Vance, CEO of one of the most powerful tech firms on the West Coast. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. For the first time that morning, he wasn't focused on numbers or meetings. He was focused on his daughter. Isabel didn't know anyone was watching. She wasn't thinking about cameras or rules or what the building's elite thought of her. She only saw a child in pain and did what her instincts told her. After a few more slow exhales, she set the bubble wand down and sat cross-legged beside the girl. The little one's breathing had settled into shallow hiccups, and though she didn't speak, her eyes followed Isabel's hands, soft and careful, opening a paper towel and offering a wrapped mint from her pocket. It wasn't a bribe. It was a gesture, a tiny act of peace. The girl didn't take it, but she didn't flinch either. That was progress. Isabel smiled and whispered one word. Safe. No lecture, no questions, just that. The girl blinked and turned her gaze upward, toward the shimmering ceiling. Around them, the mood had shifted. The onlookers, moments ago buzzing with judgment, now stood awkward and hushed. A woman tried to offer her a scarf. A man cleared his throat and mumbled, "Maybe she's special needs?" Isabel didn't answer. She wasn't there to diagnose or explain. She simply stayed until the girl's breathing matched her own. Then, like air escaping from a balloon, the tension in the room deflated. But not for long. Security arrived. 2 men in pressed uniforms walked briskly from the executive elevator, whispering into earpieces. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," one said to Isabel. She stood slowly. The girl flinched, and Isabel looked back, unsure if leaving her side was safe. "She was just helping," someone muttered, but it was too late. The guards gestured for Isabel to step aside. They didn't raise their voices, but the tone was unmistakable. suspicion wrapped in professionalism. Isabel wiped her hands on her jumpsuit and followed them silently. The girl, now sitting upright, watched her go with wide, unreadable eyes. Upstairs, behind the glass wall of his office, Callum Vance remained frozen. His assistant stood by, nervously holding a tablet. "Sir, you're meeting with Tokyo." "Cancel it," he said. His voice was distant, low. "That woman, find out who she is. Now." The assistant blinked. "The janitor?" "Yes," he said, his jaw tightening. "And get my daughter. Have them bring her up to me." His voice carried a tone no one dared question. Downstairs, Isabel stood in the maintenance hallway, arms crossed as the guards asked for her ID. One of them radioed in a report. Intervention with unauthorized interaction. Possible protocol violation. Isabel said nothing. She had been here before, not in this building, but in this moment, doing the right thing and getting punished for it. Years ago, she'd lost her teaching job for something similar, not hurting a child but comforting one, in a way the system didn't approve. She'd fought it, but the legal fees broke her. Since then, she kept her head down, cleaned toilets, mopped floors, smiled politely, never got involved, until today. A knock interrupted the interrogation. It was Callum's assistant. "Mr. Vance wants to see her," she said, pointing to Isabel. The guards looked confused. "Now?" "Yes, both her and the child." "He knows?" "He was watching the whole time." The hallway went still. Isabel blinked. She didn't know who Mr. Vance was, not really. Just that he owned the top 3 floors and was rich enough that people whispered his name like a spell. She looked at the girl, who had been brought to the hallway by a nervous nanny. The child reached out, slowly, not to the nanny, but to Isabel. Tiny fingers touched her coveralls. Not a grip. A question. Isabel answered by holding out her hand. Open. The girl placed her palm against it. No words. Just trust. The nanny looked stunned. Isabel, the janitor, simply nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just walked beside the girl toward the elevator, the golden doors opening like something out of a fairy tale. Behind them, silence fell again. But this time, it was full of awe. The elevator ride was quiet, broken only by the soft hum of machinery and the occasional sniffle from the little girl, who now stood beside Isabel, their hands still touching. Isabel didn't speak. She didn't feel she had the right. But when the doors opened to the penthouse floor and she saw the vast glass walls and sprawling view of the city, her breath caught for just a second. The space was elegant, but cold, more gallery than home. White leather chairs, a polished piano no one seemed to play. Silence, the kind that screamed money but lacked warmth. Callum stood by the window, back turned, hands in his pockets. When he turned, his face was unreadable. Strong jaw, tired eyes. "You calmed her," he said, not a question. Isabel nodded slowly. "She was overwhelmed," she said, carefully choosing her words. "She didn't need fixing. She needed space, gentle rhythm, something soft to hold on to." He studied her as if she were a riddle. "Do you have children?" "I did," Isabel said. 2 words, spoken quietly. He didn't press. "What's your name?" he asked. "Isabel." "Isabel," he repeated. Then he looked at the girl. "Her name is Nova. She's 7. She hasn't spoken in 15 months. Isabel nodded again. "That doesn't mean she can't communicate." He tilted his head, curious. "Go on." Isabel knelt again, level with Nova. She gently opened the small bubble bottle and dipped the wand. 1 bubble floated between them. Nova followed it. Then Isabel reached into her pocket and pulled out 3 small squares of colored paper. Red, blue, yellow. She laid them on the floor. "Nova," she said softly, "what color feels safe?" Nova hesitated, then pointed slowly to blue. Callum inhaled sharply. Isabel didn't react. "And what color feels scary?" Nova pointed to red. "And what color is today?" She paused, then pointed again to blue. Callum's eyes glistened, just slightly. "She's never done that." Not with the therapists. Not with me. Isabel stood, steady but careful. Because they were trying to fix her, I just listened. A long pause filled the room. Finally, Callum said, "You used to work with children like her?" Isabel nodded. "Before my son died. He was 12. Car accident. After that, I couldn't go back." Callum didn't speak. He just looked at Nova, who now sat calmly on the floor, arranging the colored squares in neat patterns. "I fired 3 specialists this month," he said almost to himself. "They all had degrees, certifications, but none of them got through." Isabel didn't respond. She didn't have to. "You did," he said. "In 5 minutes." Isabel looked down. "It's not about speed, it's about seeing her." The words lingered in the room like music notes fading into silence. Callum stepped closer. "Would you consider working with her? Not as a janitor, as whatever you were before, or are now. Whatever title you want." Isabel was still. Her body tensed, unsure if this was real. "I don't know if I can. It's been a long time." "She trusts you," he said simply. "And I trust her." That moment hung in the air like a fragile ornament. Isabel looked at Nova again, who looked up and, just for a heartbeat, smiled. The following days unfolded like pages in a book no one expected to read. Isabel didn't give an answer right away. She returned to her usual shift, mop in hand, head down, but something inside her had shifted. Nova's smile, that fleeting, delicate thing, haunted her. The building's staff whispered now when she passed, some in awe, others in confusion. A few rolled their eyes, claiming it was all a fluke. But Nova noticed. Every morning, she waited in the lobby with her new caretaker, and her eyes would scan the marble floors until they landed on Isabel. A pattern emerged. Isabel, at first hesitantly, would pause to blow a bubble. Nova would watch. No tantrums, no cries, just stillness, connection, wordless trust. On the 3rd day, Callum met her by the service elevator. He didn't speak at first. He just handed her a folder. Inside were papers, an offer, a salary beyond anything she'd ever imagined, flexible hours, and most notably, no rigid job title. Just a space where she could be what Nova needed. "I'm not trying to buy your kindness," he said, his voice low. "I'm just trying to create a space where it can thrive." Isabel looked at him. There was something raw in his eyes now, not power, but pleading. She took the folder, said nothing, and walked away. That night, she sat in her tiny kitchen, the hum of the fridge the only sound. She opened a box from her closet, one she hadn't touched in years. Inside were photographs, lesson plans, a child's drawing of a stick figure with the words, "My mom teaches with her heart." She wept quietly, then fell asleep on the couch with the bubble bottle still in her hand. The next morning, Nova's new routine changed. She reached out for Isabel's hand before the bubbles even appeared. Isabel looked at the child's fingers curled around her own and felt something break free in her chest. That afternoon, she walked into Callum's office, still wearing her coveralls, and placed the signed contract on his desk. "Only if I can do it my way," she said. No schedules, no expectations, just her pace. He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Agreed. And just like that, a janitor became something else. Not a therapist, not a nanny, not a teacher. Something new, a bridge between 2 hearts that had been left alone in different ways. Nova began to draw. First, circles, then colors, then shapes that resembled people. Always 2. One tall, one kneeling, always with bubbles in the air. She still didn't speak, but sometimes she hummed, a soft melody Isabel remembered from her own son's lullabies. Callum started staying home more. Meetings shifted, screens were turned off. He began kneeling beside his daughter instead of calling her from across the room. He listened. He slowed down. Once, Nova placed a single blue square on his palm. He cried quietly, and she didn't flinch. Isabel watched it all unfold, not as an outsider, but as a witness to something rare, a transformation that required no miracles, only presence. She began wearing blue ribbons in her hair. Nova liked blue. It made her feel safe. And safety, Isabel realized, wasn't just for children. It was something adults forget they deserve too. She no longer wore the janitor's uniform, but she kept the bubble bottle in her pocket. The tranquility that had bloomed between Isabel and Nova didn't go unnoticed for long. In a building filled with whispered conversations and eyes that constantly observed, peace was as disruptive as chaos. Questions began to surface. Why was the janitor sitting beside the billionaire's daughter? Why was she no longer in uniform? Why was she being escorted by the CEO's personal driver? The building manager, a thin man named Gregory with a fondness for order and an allergy to deviation, called Isabel into his office. He didn't offer her tea. He didn't ask how she was. He simply opened a printed policy manual and began reading. "Unauthorized personnel," he said coldly, "may not interact with residents beyond standard duties. Any violation may result in disciplinary review." Isabel remained silent. She'd been through these dances before. Gregory continued, "Several tenants have expressed concern over the blurred lines of your new role." She raised her eyebrows. "Is someone upset that a child stopped screaming?" His face twitched. "It's about appearances. Hierarchy. He paused, caught in the weight of the word he didn't want to say. "A janitor," she said for him, her tone steady. "I was. You still are, according to payroll." She stood. "Not anymore." That same afternoon, an anonymous complaint was filed to the board of the building's residential committee, citing safety concerns and unapproved interactions. Callum received it mid-meeting. He didn't even read to the second page before standing up, taking his phone and calling the board president directly. "If you ever question the people who care for my daughter again," he said, his voice a quiet blade, "you'll find yourself in a legal tangle you're not equipped to navigate." The complaint disappeared, but the whispers didn't. Isabel felt the cold shoulders in the elevator, the fake smiles in the hallway, the sudden silence when she entered a room. Even the cleaning staff, once her peers, began treating her differently, some with awe, others with jealousy, a few with open resentment. One janitor, older and bitter, muttered as she passed, "You think bubbles make you special?" Isabel didn't answer. She just walked on. But it stung. Not because she missed the mop, but because she understood how easily people project their pain when they don't understand someone else's healing. The hardest part came not from strangers, but from herself. Some nights she sat on her couch, wondering if she deserved any of this. If she was pretending. If the pain that lived in her hadn't tricked her into believing she could be whole again. She would look at the photo of her son, then at the quiet bubble wand resting beside it, and ask herself if she was chasing redemption in someone else's child. But then came the moment that silenced all doubt. Nova drew again. But this time it wasn't just two people, it was four. Nova, Isabel, Callum, and someone small, drawn like a shadow with a heart above their head. Isabel recognized the shape. Her breath caught. Nova looked up, eyes steady, and placed a hand on Isabel's chest, then tapped the figure. No words, just knowing. And Isabel understood. Nova had seen her grief and offered it a place to rest. The tension in the building didn't vanish, but Isabel no longer feared it. She had weathered worse. She had been invisible, dismissed, accused, and silenced. And yet here she stood, not because someone gave her permission, but because a little girl, with no words at all, gave her purpose. There was a time not long ago when Isabel never imagined returning to this kind of work. Not because she didn't love it, but because it had broken her. The school where she once taught had closed its doors to her after a mother accused her of being too attached to a child with behavioral struggles. Inappropriate emotional involvement, the letter had said. They never asked why she sat beside the boy during his meltdowns. They didn't want to hear about the quiet progress he made when others weren't looking. They certainly didn't care that Isabel had buried her own son just 6 months prior, a boy who had taught her how to kneel, how to wait, how to listen to silence. The hearing that followed drained her. No charges, just shame. A black mark that followed her into every job interview after. She stopped trying. A cousin connected her with a cleaning company. It paid the bills. It numbed the ache. It made her invisible, which, for a while, was what she wanted. But even ghosts have memories, and Isabel carried hers like folded letters in her chest. Each time she saw a child in distress, something stirred, a voice that said, "You still know how to help." But fear kept her quiet. Until Nova, until Bubbles, until a blue square of paper touched with trust. After that, the past no longer looked like a weight. It looked like a foundation. Nova reminded her of the children she used to teach. She didn't just remind her of her son, though that memory lived in every soft gesture. She reminded Isabel that the world still needed people who didn't flinch at pain, who didn't turn away from difference, who weren't afraid of quiet. Callum, too, began to change. Slowly, awkwardly, but earnestly. At first, he hovered in the background, uncertain of how to fit into the world Isabel and Nova had built in soft colors and stillness. Then one afternoon, Isabel handed him a small bottle of bubbles. "Your turn," she said. He looked unsure, but he knelt, dipped the wand, and blew. The first bubble popped on his own sleeve. He laughed, an actual laugh, rough with disuse. Nova giggled. Then she reached out, caught a bubble midair, and pressed it to her chest. It burst, and she said one word. "More." It was the first word she'd spoken in over a year. The room stilled. Isabel's hand covered her mouth, not in shock, but in reverence. Callum blinked, then looked at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time. "More?" he asked. Nova nodded. One word, one step. And Isabel realized that healing wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it began with the tiniest whisper of trust. From that day, Nova's world expanded. Not rapidly, not all at once, but steadily. She began humming again, tracing melodies she remembered. She stacked her blocks in patterns that Isabel recognized as rhythm exercises. She colored in spirals and began naming feelings by assigning them colors. Red for scared, yellow for new, blue for calm. And one day, she handed Isabel a green square. "You," she said. Isabel held it to her chest. "What does green mean?" Nova smiled. "Home." And Isabel understood, with a clarity that brought tears she didn't try to hide, that home wasn't always a place. Sometimes it was a person. Sometimes it was a moment of stillness between two people who had both been waiting to be seen. The invitation came quietly, almost shyly, on a Thursday afternoon. Callum had just returned from a rare off-site investor meeting, his tie loose and exhaustion behind his eyes. He found Isabel and Nova sitting cross-legged on the carpet of the penthouse solarium, tracing soft chalk lines on a portable blackboard. Nova was humming to herself, occasionally stopping to draw dots inside the loops, a rhythm only she seemed to understand. Callum stood silently, watching for a moment, then cleared his throat gently. Isabel looked up. He held out a card, thick and cream-colored, embossed with gold. She took it cautiously. It wasn't a party. It was a proposal. "There's a developmental center upstate," he said. "Not a clinic, not therapy. Just a space built for kids like Nova. Music, color, motion. But they're struggling. They need someone to consult. Someone who understands without needing words." Isabel scanned the invitation. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't corporate. It was simple. "You're offering me a job?" she asked. He shook his head. "I'm offering you a purpose if you want it." She looked at Nova, who was now drawing two stick figures again, one with a ribbon in its hair, the other with a big bubble in front of its mouth. "You want me to leave?" Callum paused. "I want you to expand. Nova will be fine if you go for a while, and if she's not, we'll go with you." The words hit Isabel like warm water over frozen skin. "We," she repeated, barely a whisper. "Yes," he said. "We." That night, Isabel sat on her fire escape, the city glowing beneath her, the bubble bottle resting on the rail. She thought about everything: the fear, the failures, the long stretch of loneliness that had felt unbreakable. And now, a child who painted her safety in colors, a man who saw her not as broken, but as essential. a future that asked her not to forget her past, but to build on it. She didn't sleep. She didn't need to. By morning, she had her answer. She walked into the penthouse with calm steps and handed Callum the card, now marked with a green square sticker Nova had placed there. "I'll go," she said, "but only if I can return." "Always," he replied. Before she left, Nova gave her a box. Inside was a folded piece of blue paper with one word written in shaky handwriting. "Safe," Isabel cried. Not out of sadness, but because for the first time in years she believed it. She boarded the train with nothing but a backpack, a bottle of bubbles, and a mission that didn't come from a job title, but from trust. And behind her, in the tallest building in the city, a little girl sat by the window, blowing bubbles into the morning light, knowing that the person who made her feel seen would always come back. Callum Vance had built an empire from silence, algorithms, software, data points that whispered meaning in the hands of the right mind. He knew how to read numbers, market shifts, the coded language of the digital world. But he had never learned to read his daughter. Not until Isabel. It wasn't that he didn't love Nova. He did deeply. But love alone hadn't been enough to crack the shell of grief and guilt he'd worn since her mother's death. He had thrown resources at the problem. Specialists, schools, private instructors, therapies with acronyms he couldn't remember. None of them reached her. And the more they failed, the more he withdrew, convincing himself that maybe he was the problem. Then a janitor blew bubbles in his lobby and changed everything. It wasn't immediate, this transformation. He didn't wake up the next day a perfect father. But he began showing up. He sat in the spaces Isabel used to occupy and tried to see the world through Nova's eyes. He noticed patterns in her silence, rhythms in her breath, colors in her moods. He stopped speaking in commands and started asking questions, even if they went unanswered. He began to listen without needing language. One morning, Nova pulled out a new set of colored cards she'd made. On each was a word she had chosen, written in Isabel's careful block letters. The red card said, "Too loud." The yellow one said, "Wait." The green said, "Good." And the blue, always the blue, said, "Here." She handed that one to her father. He held it like a relic. "Here," she repeated, tapping his chest. He nodded, tears thick in his eyes. "I'm here." They began building routines, rituals born from softness. Mornings started with bubbles, afternoons with stories Nova would illustrate in pictures, and evenings with quiet music and lullabies Isabel had once hummed. She returned from her upstate consulting with new ideas, tools that didn't look like therapy, but felt like freedom. Nova thrived. She began stacking colored blocks in sequences that matched her emotions. She danced in the kitchen. She sang, not always with words, but with sound. She didn't speak often, but when she did, each word landed like a prayer. One night, as Callum tucked her into bed, she touched his cheek and whispered, "Not broken." He swallowed hard. "Who?" "Me," she said. Then after a pause, "You too." Isabel, standing at the door, pressed a hand to her mouth. Healing, she realized, didn't just flow from adult to child. Sometimes children taught the way forward. The more Nova opened, the more Callum softened. He reorganized his company's priorities, added a sensory-friendly wing to the corporate daycare, funded scholarships for neurodiverse learners, not because it was trendy, but because it mattered, because it was real, because his daughter had taught him that value couldn't always be measured in output. And in the quiet spaces between meetings and bedtime stories, something else grew. A bond not built on obligation, but on shared reverence. Isabel had become more than Nova's guide. She was now Callum's anchor, though neither of them spoke of it directly. Not yet. But sometimes their hands touched briefly when passing a toy or a mug. Sometimes their laughter lingered longer than necessary. Sometimes he found himself watching her the way people watch waves, calm, powerful, and necessary. And each time he did, Nova would smile knowingly and return to her drawings, adding a third figure now and then, standing just a little closer to the other two. The moment the building staff learned Isabel was officially no longer part of the janitorial team, reactions were swift and divided. Some, like Gregory the manager, couldn't hide their disapproval, muttering about broken chains of command and dangerous precedents. Others, particularly among the younger staff, watched her with wide eyes, as if witnessing someone who had cracked the rules of the universe and stepped into a life they didn't know was possible. Isabel didn't change her walk or her tone. She still greeted the cleaning crew in the break room, still helped carry heavy bins when she passed someone struggling, but she no longer wore the uniform. She no longer entered through the back door. She was now someone who walked beside the residents, not behind them. The parents in the building started asking her quiet questions in the elevator. What do you do with your child when they can't sit still? Is there a toy that helps with transitions? How did you get her to sleep through the night? Isabel answered when she could, smiled when she couldn't, and always emphasized that there were no miracles, just patience, curiosity, and listening. Word of Nova's transformation began to spread beyond the building. A local parent group invited Isabel to speak, then a podcast, then a private school asked her to consult on a sensory room design. Each time she hesitated, wondering if she was really the right person. Each time, Nova would hand her a color card before she left. Always blue, always here. In the background, Callum watched it all. At first, he offered silent support, driving her to appointments, adjusting his meetings to accommodate Nova's rhythms. Then, slowly, something changed. He began speaking Isabel's name with ease, introducing her not as Nova's helper or support, but as our guide, our light, sometimes simply family. The staff noticed, the neighbors noticed, rumors flew about the CEO and the former janitor. Some called it inappropriate, others romantic. But Callum didn't hide it. One morning, Nova handed them each a green card at breakfast. "What's this?" he asked. "Together," she said. Isabel's breath caught. They didn't speak about it again, but later that night, Callum sat beside Isabel on the couch and placed his hand over hers. They didn't kiss. They didn't make promises. But their silence was rich, full of all the things they didn't need to say out loud. The next day, Isabel walked into the same lobby where she'd once been questioned by security and greeted Gregory with a simple nod. He cleared his throat and said, "Miss Isabel," for the first time, and she smiled. That afternoon, as she walked Nova through the park, a little boy had a meltdown near the fountain. His mother looked helpless, overwhelmed. Without thinking, Isabel knelt beside him, not to fix, not to speak, but to be still. She blew one soft bubble into the air. The boy's cries faltered, the mother's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Isabel nodded. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you just have to kneel and listen." As she stood, Nova reached for her hand, and Isabel realized something profound. She hadn't been given a second chance at life. She had given herself one. The seasons began to change, and with them, so did everything else. The trees lining the boulevard outside Aurora Towers shifted from deep summer green to golden amber, as if the world itself had taken notice of the quiet revolution inside one little girl, her father, and the woman who had brought them back to each other. Isabel no longer counted days by cleaning schedules or meal breaks, but by Nova's colors, by the slow and beautiful expansion of a child who now trusted the world enough to dance in it. One morning, Nova opened the window and let a bubble float freely into the cold air. She turned to Isabel and said, "Send it far. Someone might need it." Isabel smiled and nodded, because she knew. Sometimes healing travels quietly, without destination, and finds who it's meant for. The penthouse had changed, too. The sterile white walls now bore Nova's drawings, framed and uncorrected. The piano that once sat untouched now filled the space with hesitant, joyful notes, played not by a tutor, but by Nova's own hands. Callum had installed a small studio space where Isabel could meet with parents, host workshops, and even begin documenting her approach. She called it the quiet method. It wasn't a curriculum or a product. It was a way of seeing, a way of being with children that didn't try to fix them but sought to understand them. It started to spread. Other buildings, schools, and even companies began to reach out. But Isabel was careful. She didn't want to become an industry. She wanted to stay close to the core, the silence, the presence, the listening. Her days remained centered on Nova. and Nova, now more comfortable in the world, began to use her voice. Not always in words, but in song, gesture, and the occasional sentence that landed like poetry. One afternoon, as the sun poured through the window, Nova said to Isabel, "You're my always." Isabel, stunned, didn't answer right away. Then she whispered back, "And you're my reason." In time, Callum and Isabel's bond deepened into something neither of them rushed. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a steady, gentle unfolding. Some nights they sat on the balcony in shared silence. Some mornings they exchanged glances across the breakfast table that said more than words could. Nova would often draw the three of them now, not as stick figures, but as colors. Isabel in green, Callum in yellow, herself in blue. "Together," she'd say, pressing all three colors onto a single page. There was no formal proposal, no public declaration, just a life being lived, day by day, with intention and care. And one rainy evening, as Nova fell asleep in Isabel's lap, Callum whispered, "I used to think money solved everything." Isabel looked at him, tired and content. "And now?" He smiled. "Now I know. It's bubbles." She laughed, soft and free. "Not the kind you trade on Wall Street," he added. "The kind you blow when no one else knows what to do." In the end, Isabel didn't return to who she was before her grief. She became something new, someone shaped by sorrow, refined by silence, and empowered by the smallest act of kindness. A janitor, no longer. A teacher, once more. But most of all, a woman who listened when no one else could. And as long as she had a bottle of bubbles in her pocket, she would always find a way to reach the unreachable. Because sometimes all it takes is a soft breath, a floating sphere of light, and a heart brave enough to kneel.